The last words anyone ever heard from Amelia Earhart crackled through a radio receiver on a sweltering July morning in 1937. They were fragmented, urgent, and laced with a desperation that those listening would never forget. Then came silence. A silence so complete, so absolute, that it has echoed across nearly 9 decades of human imagination, spawning theories, expeditions, heartbreak, and obsession in equal measure. What happened in those final hours above the vast, indifferent Pacific Ocean remains one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of human flight. To understand what was lost that day, you first have to understand what was at stake. Earhart was not simply a pilot attempting a stunt. She was the most famous aviator in the world, a woman who had already crossed the Atlantic solo, who had shattered records and cultural barriers with equal determination. Her planned circumnavigation of the globe along an equatorial route was her most ambitious undertaking yet, roughly 40,000 kilometers, the longest such route ever attempted at the time. She and her navigator, Fred Noonan, had already completed more than 35,000 kilometers of the journey when they departed from Lae, New Guinea on July 2, 1937. Their destination was a tiny speck of land called Howland Island, barely 3 kilometers long, sitting almost invisibly in the Central Pacific. It was the most critical and dangerous leg of the entire flight. The witnesses to the final transmission were not casual observers. They were trained radio operators, military personnel, and Coast Guard crew aboard a vessel stationed near Howland Island, specifically to guide Earhart in. The ship had been positioned there for days, its radio equipment primed and ready. The crew were alert, professional, and deeply aware of the historical significance of their role. When Earhart's voice finally broke through the static that morning, what they heard was not the confident tone of a record breaker nearing her goal. It was something else entirely. Her transmissions, logged carefully by the ship's radio operator, painted a picture of mounting confusion and anxiety. She reported flying at an altitude of roughly 1,000 feet, searching desperately for the island. She gave a position reading that suggested she believed herself to be in the correct area. She stated that fuel was running low, dangerously low. In one transmission, her voice carried a quality that the operator later described as strained, almost frantic. She reported that they were flying on a north-south line, attempting to locate the island visually. And then, sometime around 8:43 in the morning, local time, the transmissions stopped. What makes this silence so haunting is not merely that it occurred, but the specific details surrounding it. The Coast Guard vessel attempted to respond to Earhart throughout her transmissions, but there is strong evidence that she never received those responses. Her radio equipment had been modified before departure, and certain decisions made about the antenna configuration may have severely limited her ability to receive incoming signals. She was, in a very real sense, calling out into a void, unable to hear the voices trying to guide her home. The tragedy of those final moments may have been not just physical disorientation, but a profound and terrifying isolation, shouting into silence while help was close enough to touch. The investigation that followed was the largest air and sea search in American naval history up to that point. Vessels scoured approximately 250,000 square kilometers of ocean over a period of 16 days. Aircraft flew low over the water and over every island in the search zone. Nothing was found. No wreckage, no oil slick, no debris field, no bodies. The ocean offered no answers, only its vast, unchanging surface reflecting the sky back at the searchers. The official conclusion was that Earhart and Noonan had run out of fuel, ditched in the ocean, and sunk. It was a rational, reasonable explanation. It was also deeply unsatisfying to many who studied the case closely. The reason it remained unsatisfying is that the details do not close cleanly. In the days following the disappearance, multiple radio operators, some amateur, some professional, reported receiving transmissions that they believed came from Earhart's aircraft. These signals, logged from locations across the Pacific and even the continental United States, described a downed aircraft on a reef, a navigator injured, a pilot alive. One young woman in Florida kept detailed notes of what she claimed to receive over several days. Investigators at the time largely dismissed these signals as wishful thinking or atmospheric interference. But the sheer volume of reported contacts and the consistency of certain details across independent listeners who could not have coordinated their accounts has kept researchers returning to these logs for decades. This is where the case connects to a broader pattern that investigators of unexplained disappearances find deeply compelling. The Pacific Ocean has a long and documented history of swallowing aircraft and vessels without trace. only for fragments of the story to resurface years or even decades later. In several cases involving wartime aircraft, wreckage and remains were located on remote islands long after official searches had concluded. The islands of the Central Pacific, many of them uninhabited and rarely visited, have yielded unexpected discoveries with some regularity. Bones, equipment, artifacts. The ocean does not always keep its secrets permanently. In 1940, a British colonial officer on a remote island called Nikumaroro, located southeast of Howland Island, reported finding a partial human skeleton near the remains of a campfire. The bones were sent to Fiji for examination. A physician at the time concluded they were likely male. But the measurements recorded before the bones were subsequently lost have been reanalyzed multiple times using modern forensic methods. Several contemporary analysts have concluded that the skeletal measurements are more consistent with a woman of Earhart's approximate height and build than with the male classification originally assigned. The bones themselves have never been relocated. On that same island, researchers have found what they describe as artifacts consistent with a small camp. Fragments of a jar that matches a type of freckle cream that Earhart was known to use, remnants of a campfire, the bones of birds and fish suggesting someone survived there for a period of time. The island was uninhabited in 1937. None of these artifacts constitute proof. Each one, individually, could have arrived on the island through any number of means. But taken together, they form a pattern that serious researchers find difficult to dismiss entirely. The theories that have emerged over the decades fall into several broad categories, each with its own body of evidence and its own passionate advocates. The most widely accepted among aviation experts remains the fuel exhaustion and ocean ditching theory, that the aircraft simply ran out of fuel, came down in open water, and sank rapidly in deep ocean. This is consistent with the known fuel load, the known flight duration, and the known limitations of the navigation equipment of the era. It is clean, logical, and deeply sad. A second theory holds that Earhart and Noonan did not crash in open ocean, but instead landed or ditched near a reef or island, survived for some period of time, and eventually died of thirst, injury, or exposure before rescue could reach them. The Nikumaroro evidence is the primary support for this theory. If true, it transforms the story from a sudden disappearance into something more prolonged and more harrowing. Two people stranded on a remote island, watching the horizon for ships that never came, perhaps still transmitting on a radio that no one was listening to closely enough. A third theory, the one that has captured the darkest corner of public imagination, involves capture. Some researchers have proposed that Earhart and Noonan were on a covert intelligence mission, that their route took them deliberately over Japanese-controlled islands in the Pacific, and that they were intercepted, captured, and held or executed by Japanese military forces. This theory gained significant traction in certain decades and has never been entirely extinguished, despite the lack of any verifiable documentary evidence from Japanese military archives to support it. The archives that have been examined suggest no knowledge of Earhart. But absence of evidence, as investigators always note, is not the same as evidence of absence. What remains genuinely, stubbornly unexplained is the gap between what the radio evidence suggests and what the physical evidence confirms. If Earhart ditched in open ocean and sank, why were there so many reported radio transmissions in the days that followed? Transmissions require power. Power requires a functioning aircraft, or at minimum, a functioning battery. A sunken aircraft provides neither. The post-law signals, if any of them were genuine, suggest the aircraft was on land or on a reef, not at the bottom of the ocean. And if the aircraft was on land, why was no wreckage ever conclusively found? The ocean floor near Howland Island lies at extraordinary depths. Modern underwater search technology has examined portions of the probable crash zone and found nothing identifiable. But the search area is enormous, the depths are extreme, and the ocean floor in that region is complex terrain. The absence of a confirmed wreck site does not close the case. It simply means the answer, if it exists, has not yet been found. What lingers most powerfully about the Earhart mystery is not the question of what happened to her aircraft. It is the question of what those final hours felt like. A woman of extraordinary courage and capability, flying through the pre-dawn darkness over a featureless ocean, searching for an island she could not find, calling out on a radio that could not hear the answers being sent back. The fuel gauges dropping, the sky beginning to lighten, the ocean stretching in every direction without landmark or reference. And then, at some point, a decision, or the absence of one, and silence. The silence has never truly ended. It has simply changed shape over the years, becoming a container for everything we project into it. Our admiration for her courage, our grief at her loss, our discomfort with the idea that someone so remarkable could simply vanish without explanation. The mystery of Amelia Earhart endures not because the evidence is particularly supernatural or inexplicable, but because the human story at its center is so livid, so immediate, and so unresolved. Somewhere in the Pacific, the answer exists. In a depth of water, on a reef, beneath the sand of a remote island, or in an archive not yet examined. The ocean is patient. It has kept its secret for nearly 90 years. Whether it will surrender that secret in our lifetime is a question that researchers, explorers, and listeners like you continue to ask. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thought of all, that somewhere in the world right now, the evidence that would finally close this mystery may already exist, waiting to be recognized for what it is. If this story made you lean forward, if it left you with questions you want to keep asking, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Leave a comment below with your own theory. The community here takes these discussions seriously, and some of the most compelling leads have come from listeners who noticed something others missed. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next mystery begins. Because the silence, as always, is only temporary.